Again, all you really need to do with this is scrape away the excess glue, and then come back with a little bit of sandpaper. Try not to sand too much because you don't want to remove all the detail. But as you can see, did a good job of gluing there, and the seam line just disappears. For our Japanese wheel, since it has a hole in the hub, then all we really need to do is let the Dremel tool do the work for us. A little bit of sandpaper. As you can see, the mold line virtually disappears. Once we paint it, you'll never see it. You'll also notice that the tread pattern has seemed to be worn away from the sanding. Well, this is fine too, because in actual service, the tread pattern did get worn away. Our next subassembly that we'll work with are our gear struts. When you're taking a look at your reference photographs, you'll notice that sometimes when the aircraft is heavily loaded, the gear struts are relatively compressed. However, when lightly loaded, you'll see that they're extended quite a bit. What we're going to do with this one is use our razor saw to cut the oleo so that we can reposition the whole strut and make it look like it's sitting under a heavy load. Very simple cut. Take care not to cut into the torque link behind the oleo. Make your strokes nice and easy, and try to be as perfectly perpendicular to the oleo as you possibly can get. We'll clean up any discrepancies later on with an X-Acto blade. Carefully cut the elbow of the torque link so that the two pieces of the strut can be removed. Do your best not to damage that torque link unless you want to build a new one. Match up the oleo that you just cut away with a piece of suitably sized aluminum tubing. Next, trim your struts so they're nice and flat. Locate the center of the strut, and with a suitably sized drill bit, use your pin vise to drill out the strut. About 1/8 of an inch deep. Try to be as straight and true as possible. You say you're in need to replace the oleo with a piece of aluminum or brass in order to retain the structural integrity of the strut. And use a piece of bent wire to hold superglue. Hold a little drop of superglue, and the superglue will hold your strut in place. And there you see the completed strut with the aluminum oleo. While we're at it with the Dremel tool, let's add a little bit of realism to our Messerschmitt 109 by adding some battle damage. You see, while we're building these little models, sometimes we have a tendency to forget the tremendous amount of damage that these and other aircraft suffered during the war. The aerial weapons of the day, such as 50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon, didn't make the nice little rat-a-tat holes we see romanticized in the movies. Rather, the opposite was true. Huge gaping holes were torn into the aircraft surfaces when a group of shells hit their target. Bombers flying through flak bursts returned home looking like sieves. Stray hits were common too, and we'll attempt to depict this by using a rounded burr on a Dremel tool to shave away plastic so that it appears paper thin. You can see that as you shave your plastic down, the plastic becomes translucent. The trick here is to get to the point to where the plastic is virtually paper thin. Leave the area untouched for now, except to paint the inside aluminum. You'll need to mark this area also on the instruction sheet for future reference. Later, after assembly, we'll complete the battle damage. Let's stay on the subject of battle damage for a little while with a demonstration of a technique that I developed over 20 years ago. Now, I'll warn you right now that this particular technique is not for the weak at heart, because it involves intentionally burning your completed and finished model. Often, Aircraft suffered structural damage as a consequence of some unfortunate meeting with a solid, unyielding object. You know, like the ground. The result was a crumpled panel section, or a bent wing, or the like, which could be repaired with a similar part from an unflyable aircraft. So let's pick on our B-17 since it has a nice aluminum finish. But I will let you know that the technique does work well on painted surfaces. I'm using Bare Metal brand self-adhesive foil, which is available in a variety of finishes at your local hobby shop. I like to measure the areas I'm going to foil to save materials and keep from handling large pieces of foil. Transfer your measurements like this. Cut the section, peel the backing away, and, using a pair of tweezers, position the foil like so. I always try to work from the center out to the edges because it minimizes wrinkling of the foil, which becomes a really critical factor on compound curved surfaces. I also use a Teflon-tipped burnisher available at a local art supply store to burnish the aluminum down to the plastic surface. However, a Q-tip will work equally well. Rotate the bare metal foil 90 degrees and use different finishes to break up the monotony of these large paneled surfaces. Second, and this is the hard part now, you need to heat the area with a butane lighter. Watch closely. I'm moving the butane lighter from over the top to the bottom, keeping the flame close to the aircraft. Now, as the plastic softens, you can bend the area, poke it with a rounded pole, or anything suitable to achieve the desired effect. Inevitably, things happen that you hadn't planned for. You just have to be flexible and ready for them. I've got a burn-through area here. Not a problem. A little piece of aluminum foil will cover it up and no one will be the wiser. Any scorching can be removed with lacquer thinner on a Q-tip. Once completed, you can apply whatever clear protective finish you choose. Before we actually put paint to plastic, let's go over some painting basics that apply to any other form of modeling. The first involves that four-letter curse word of modeling, dust. For those of us without state-of-the-art clean rooms, there are some steps that can be taken in order to virtually eliminate the hazard. One is to paint in an enclosed room. Now, I know this violates the sacred cow of painting in a well-ventilated area, but ventilation means that air is moving, carrying dust. You need an enclosed room so that you can evacuate the airborne dust. One way of doing that is to make sure that you stir up any dust that is in the room. But you should always keep your room clean nevertheless. So, in order to stir up the air in the room, we're going to turn on a fan. If you don't happen to have a ceiling fan like I do, you can use an oscillating fan or a floor fan. Anything will work just to get the dust stirred up in the room. At the same time I turn my ceiling fan on, I turn on my ventilator fan for about a half hour prior to painting. Once I begin to paint, I turn off the ceiling fan, but I leave my ventilator fan going. If you haven't the luxury of a ventilation fan, this high-tech air filter available from VA Environmental Marketing will do the trick. It not only removes all the dust in a small room, but it also eliminates paint fumes. I'll be using an airbrush to do most of the painting. However, if you don't have an airbrush, many of the colors that we'll be using are available in paint cans, the use of which I'll cover later. Paint cans are a little bit more expensive and require more masking than airbrushing, but the techniques are basically the same. Before a spray job, you want to ensure your airbrush is absolutely spotless. Even minute particles will clog the brush and make you crazy. I use a pipe cleaner soaked in lacquer thinner in order to clean petroleum-based paints. My favorite primer is Floquil Gray Primer. It's a lacquer-based paint that chemically bonds to the plastic. Modelers in the know will tell you that lacquer paint crazes plastic, but I'll show you how to lay down a barrier coat that will not harm plastic at all. For mixing my paint, I use graduated cups, available at full-service pharmacies for a very cheap price. Measure a known amount. Better too much than too little. Always use fresh paint to prevent clumping of the paint. The basic mix should start at approximately 60% pigment to 40% thinner. After spraying this mix, you may find your airbrush works better with a slightly different mixture ratio. A general rule of thumb: the thinner the mix, the more spatter you get. The thicker, or the more it clumps for an undesirable effect called orange peeling. With lacquer-based paints such as Floquil, use either Floquil thinner or a lacquer thinner available at your local hardware store. Once mixed and properly thinned, pour your mix into the airbrush paint cup. I use a piece of nylon hose to filter out any big particles that might be trying to sneak through. Prior to painting your part, wipe it with a tack rag. These are available at any hardware store, and they are great for picking up excess dust.